We begin with breaking news related to the Karen Reed trial. Michael Proctor, the lead state police investigator, has been relieved of his duties effective immediately.
Now, do you see a response toward the bottom of the page from yourself, January 29, 2022 at 11:04 p.m.?
Yes.
And can you read that response for the jury?
Yeah, but there'll be some serious charges brought on the girl.
And what did you mean by that, sir?
That throughout the course of the day we had...
Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Tanaka with a WBZ News update. Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor has been reassigned following the Karen Reed trial. WBZ I-Team sources say he's been transferred to a South Boston Field Services Division. He was relieved of duty due to offensive text messages and unprofessional behavior revealed during the trial. He'll soon have a disciplinary hearing. Now, he could be restored to full duty or he could be fired.
Trooper Proctor, everyone's favorite Massachusetts State Police trooper, has been relieved of duty. My apologies to all the people from Massachusetts for my awful, awful accent. I just couldn't help myself after like 10 weeks of living out of the Dedham courthouse for the Karen Reed trial. Of course, the Karen Reed trial is over. For now, anyway, since the trial ended with a hung jury and therefore a mistrial. It's arguably not the result that anyone really seemed to want at the end of 9 weeks of testimony, but it is what it is. But of course, there's this very interesting new development that immediately followed the jury's conclusion that they couldn't reach a verdict. And that is that Trooper Michael Proctor has been officially relieved of his duties and has been transferred out of his most recent position at the Norfolk County DA's office detective unit. So does this mean that he's been completely fired from the MSP? What does this all mean for the apparently planned retrial of Karen Reed? Are there any other implications of all of this? Watch until the end. And in the end, I want to know what you think. Let's get into it. So if you're not familiar, Trooper Michael Proctor was the lead investigator from the Massachusetts State Police in the Karen Reed trial. He was accused by the defense of doing a number of things. This included having undisclosed social ties with the Albert and McCabe families, who were central to Karen Reed's argument that she was being framed in this case. The defense also accused Trooper Michael Proctor of actively engaging in that alleged conspiracy with the Alberts and the McCabes, and of doing shoddy investigative work. The biggest bit of information that came out of the trial related to Trooper Proctor was the series of horrifying text messages that were revealed. As it turns out, he texted not only his colleagues and supervisors, but also his wife and friends from high school, all about this case. And that was when the investigation was active and ongoing. And not only that, but he also texted horrible, derogatory, dehumanizing things about Karen Reed. This included telling his colleagues and supervisors that he was looking for nudes through her phone, referring to her as the client of her attorney, David Yannetti.
If you could just read the three responses from yourself, sir.
Okay, so these came from me. Funny, I'm going through his retarded client's phone. No nude so far. I hate that man. I truly hate him.
This also included him basically telling anyone who would listen that he thought that she was a whack job and a see you next Tuesday, if you know what I mean.
And turning your attention to the next page, 2538, at the top, if you could just read a series of responses from yourself, correct?
Yes, sir.
Read from those, sir.
Yep, so these came from me. From all accounts, he didn't do anything wrong. She's a whack job. C-U-N-T.
Objection.
So don't spell it. You have to. So these are your words, Trooper Proctor?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead and say them.
Yes, she's a babe. Weird Fall River accent, though. No ass.
It also included him giving his high school buddies detailed information about some of her highly sensitive medical issues connected particularly with apparently a diagnosis of Crohn's disease.
Number ending in 4146. Question, is that chick a smoke? Again, 4146 question mark. I respond EH. I respond again, nutbag, as Chief would say. I also respond with, she's got a leaky balloon knot. Leaks poo.
And what, if anything, is that in reference to, sir?
Again, to misread some medical conditions there. Again, unprofessional comments I should not have made. that I'm not proud of.
This is information that he only could have had because of his position as the lead investigator in this case. And by the way, the few texts played in these clips just now are just a tiny sample of what was actually read out in court. Now, there are a number of reasons why people might react strongly to these text messages. I mean, first, of course, there's the obvious. The way that he's talking about Karen Reed is just beyond horrifying. Just thinking these things about another human being is one thing, and then going around and saying them out loud is quite another. Then there's the level of impropriety of saying anything about an active investigation to anyone outside of the Massachusetts State Police. But then there's also the concern over whether Trooper Proctor has basically the mental capacity to look at a case like this as a dispassionate, objective investigator who can actually look at a case like this to get to the actual truth, not just some conclusion that confirms his own biases. And this was the biggest issue for me personally around this whole issue. Looking at this whole body of text messages, I find it preposterous that anyone could look at the situation and say, yeah, these aren't great, but they had no impact on his investigating the case properly. I mean, even his justification for why he used this language highlighted a significant issue in his investigation process.
Showing you another document, sir. Before I get into that, though, if I could turn your attention back to some of the comments on the language used in the January 29th and February 1st or 2nd text communications among your friend group. With reference to that particular time frame and the language that you used, what sort of information have you gathered to that point, and why would you say or use that particular language in your, particularly in your descriptions of the defendant?
So this is, 16, 18 hours later, and I conducted multiple interviews.
Speak up.
Conducted multiple interviews. We knew Mr. O'Keefe never went into Fairview Road. We knew there was one shoe at the scene, one shoe at the hospital. Based off Mr. O'Keefe's injuries, Miss Reed's statements when Sergeant Buchanan and I interviewed her, her broken taillight, the missing taillight, some taillight pieces found at the scene, the compelling evidence pointing directly at Miss Reed that she struck Mr. O'Keefe with her vehicle led me to make those comments. Whether, like I said, they weren't professional comments, but based on the day's investigation, it was clear that Miss Reed had struck Mr. O'Keefe with her vehicle.
As you just saw, in the same breath that he just said these text messages had no bearing on the investigation, he also admitted that just 16 hours into investigating the case, he came to the conclusion that Karen Reed was the one who killed John O'Keefe. To me, those two things do not connect. To put it in another perspective, this case is so complex that after 24 hours of deliberation, the jury couldn't come to a unanimous conclusion. It's also so complex, the medical examiner couldn't come to a conclusion on John O'Keefe's manner of death even after 90 whole days of examining him and the other evidence around him in this case. So it seems, to me anyway, that the only way that anyone could conclude firmly that she's guilty after investigating for only 16 hours before doing any substantive interviews of anyone other than Karen Reed, by the way, is because they came to a premature conclusion. So to say that Trooper Proctor's attitudes toward Karen Reed from the get-go in this case had no bearing on the quality of the investigation into this case is just completely disingenuous, I think. Anyway, that's my opinion on Trooper Proctor and this whole issue. I know that certainly not everyone agrees with me. I've seen enough discourse online to see that there are people that think that Trooper Proctor's texts amount to basically unprofessional yet unrelated to the quality of the investigation. But for everyone who is aware of Trooper Proctor's texts and was horrified and disgusted by them, the fact of his removal from duty is, in fact, delightful news. But what exactly does it mean for him to be relieved of duty? Here's what we know. For one thing, he has been transferred out of his latest position at the Norfolk County DA's Office Detective Unit. Here's the actual statement from the Massachusetts State Police on this issue as tweeted out by Christina Rex from WBZ. Following the mistrial in Commonwealth v. Karen Reed, the Massachusetts State Police would like to offer our condolences again to the family family of Boston police officer John O'Keefe. We cannot imagine the way in which this result has heightened the O'Keefe family's immeasurable grief, heartache, and sense of loss. John lived a life of honorable service, both to the city of Boston and the children entrusted to his care after the unexpected death of his sister and brother-in-law. We will remember him. Upon learning today's result, the department took immediate action to relieve Trooper Michael Proctor of duty and formally transfer him out of the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office State Police Detectives Unit. This follows our previous decision to open an internal affairs investigation after information about serious misconduct emerged in testimony at the trial. This investigation is ongoing. Our focus remains on delivering the highest level of police services with professionalism and integrity. Colonel Mon. Now, technically, he'll be officially relieved of duty on July 7th. This is according to the rules laid out in Proctor's union agreement, apparently. And so this is a very important thing to keep in mind here. Unlike probably most people in the US, who generally are hired on an at-will basis, there are going to be a number of administrative steps before Trooper Proctor can be fully fired from the Massachusetts State Police. First, there's going to be a duty status hearing. At this hearing, a decision is going to be made as to what to do with him. Either he'll be retained with full pay, in other words, he goes back to business as usual, or he'll be put on restricted duty, meaning he can go back to work, but with maybe some limitations, suspended without pay, meaning he can't work, but he still gets a paycheck, or suspended without pay. Now, I know how a lot of people want this hearing to go, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people who would like to see him suspended without pay due to the egregiousness of these text messages and what they actually mean about the investigation as a whole. However, it's important to note that even if he gets the worst of the four, he still won't be terminated yet at that point. There are more hoops for him to jump through before that ever happens, and this is all thanks to the fact that he's a member of the State Police Association of Massachusetts, the union for the MSP troopers. Love the unions or hate the unions, right now Trooper Proctor is probably thanking his lucky stars that he's a member of one. And what's more, they seem to also be defending him in the court of public opinion as well. According to Boston.com, Brian Williams, the president of the union, maintained that Proctor's text messages have no relationship to any of the allegations of cover-ups, collusion, or conspiracies offered by the defense. Specifically, he said, "The association is proud of the work our members do each day, as well as the fact that our Massachusetts homicide solve rate is the envy of the country. At the same time, we must be clear that we do not condone the language used in text messages presented as evidence during the trial." And then Williams went on to say that Reed's defense blurred the lines between fact and innuendo. So, okay, that's the stance that they want to take. That's the stance that they're going to take. I, of course, completely disagree with basically all of that, but that's just me. And now on the other hand, Massachusetts State Police Colonel Mon also held a press conference about this whole thing on Tuesday. At the press conference, like he did in the initial statement by the MSP, he pointed to an internal affairs investigation into Trooper Proctor's conduct that's been opened up as a direct result of these text messages that came out at trial.
Yeah, I think I've been very clear, and I want to remain very clear. Misconduct in any way, shape, or form of the Massachusetts State Police will not be tolerated. I think I've said that I condemn those comments in the strongest terms possible. They are not reflective of the Massachusetts State Police. That's not where we want to be as an organization. And I believe that we will certainly continue to monitor that and as we are moving through the process of our internal affairs investigation.
And he also expressed that the Massachusetts State Police was going to need to rebuild trust with the public as a result of this whole ordeal.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent upon us to be in a continuous cycle of earning and maintaining public trust and legitimacy. That's we cannot do our job effectively without that. And we are hyper-focused on being able to do that and conducting ourselves in a way that demonstrates that we can do that and that we are worthy of trust. And as we move forward in this organization, we will be mindful of that, and we will be making sure that we're all doing our very best to show the public that we can be what they need us to be.
Have you been in touch with the feds?
But now the MSP is currently getting a lot of heat for this. So these statements to the press do seem appropriate, as does the disciplinary process for Trooper Proctor. But the nagging question that still comes up is, how long will all of this last? This dedication to looking into this whole problem and reforming the issues that caused it in the first place. At what point will the public discourse about this issue turn to some other topic? And when that eventually happens, what will happen with Trooper Proctor and the MSP? It could be, for example, that in the process of all of that administrative red tape for his disciplinary hearings, that he just, at some point along the way, gets quietly reassigned somewhere until he can play out the rest of his employment before his retirement date, whenever that may be, and end up having a retirement pension for the rest of his life. And so Colonel Mon might just be giving political talking points right now while the spotlight is on the MSP with no real change to be had for the long term. I admit that's a bit more of a pessimistic approach, of course, but this is where it might actually be, in some ways anyway, a bit of a blessing, if you can believe it, that Karen Reed's trial ended in a mistrial. Because, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this video, the Norfolk County DA has said that they plan to retry Karen Reed as soon as possible. And so the fervor around Trooper Proctor is likely to continue burning for a bit longer. And so here's where this whole issue just may end up benefiting Karen Reed. Think about this for a minute. So long as Karen Reed continues to be pursued by the Norfolk County DA, there will be public interest in her case. The Free Karen Reed movement so far has shown no signs of stopping or even slowing down in the current state of affairs, by all appearances. And while that's all going on, people are not going to be forgetting about Trooper Proctor and his texts and his investigation into Karen Reed, because it's the thing that underpins the entire case. And what's more, if we do in fact see a second trial in this case, those text messages will likely be coming in again. And so will the fact that he's been subject to disciplinary proceedings now due to his conduct in the case. So there's a really good chance that a second jury hears about all of that. And the defense can now have a chance to put a finer point on how his attitudes towards Karen Reed served as a fatal flaw in the foundation to the investigation that underpins this whole case. And the thing is, that is obviously incredibly beneficial to the defense of Karen Reed in this case, if in fact it does go to trial a second time. But there is another reality here that this brings, which is a bit more political in nature. And when I say political, I'm not talking about like Republican versus Democrat in a partisan kind of sense. I mean the dynamics behind the scenes that impact these various governmental entities and how they relate with one another and with the public. Now, keep in mind, the district attorney's office is supposed to represent the people, the public. The DA is an elected official after all, and so they should be listening to the public when it comes to the cases that they pursue, particularly cases that capture the public consciousness. And from all appearances, there does seem to be public pressure on the Norfolk County DA to drop these charges after the mistrial. And now, with the MSP also getting heat from the public, this introduces another interesting wrinkle on the political side of this trial. I mean, even Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey has commented on Trooper Proctor's texts, calling them disgusting, and saying she fully supports the decision to proceed with disciplinary hearings over them. And so, I also think that this means that the Norfolk County DA's insistence on retrying Karen Reed is likely to prolong the public pressure on the Massachusetts State Police as well. And keep in mind, these two entities have to work together over the long term. And so this could mean that the MSP then becomes another direction from which the Norfolk County DA gets pressure to potentially drop the charges. I don't know for sure that this would happen, but I can totally see it happening. And if it did, I think that it would be likely to be a quiet behind-the-scenes discussion between the two entities. So that's just another thing that to me is very interesting about all of these developments. But, of course, as with all things, time will tell. But also, as a civil litigator, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one more thing that can result from this whole issue of Trooper Proctor's text messages. And that is possible civil liability. Now, of course, his employment is one thing, but I still maintain that Karen Reed has a potentially actionable claim against him for these text messages. Now, people have asked if Karen Reed could sue for something like defamation, but defamation would require some kind of a lie or something inaccurate about the statements that he made about Karen Reed in order to proceed on that kind of a claim. And really, there was nothing that jumped out at me among all these text messages that was specifically defamatory. The statements were either relatively true statements about her, for example, her medical history, or at least I think that's the case, or they were statements of Trooper Proctor's opinion about her, which are not actionable for purposes of defamation. However, There is such a civil claim called publication of private facts. This is basically where someone has private information of another person and discloses that to people who have basically no business of knowing that information. Specifically, there are 4 elements to the claim. First is public disclosure, meaning that the person has given publicity to these facts. The second element is it's a private fact. It's information that's generally not known about this person. Then the third element is that it is offensive to a reasonable person, meaning that the publication of these facts are offensive to a reasonable person of ordinary sensibilities. And finally, the disclosure can't be newsworthy. This means that the facts disclosed aren't a matter of legitimate public concern. Now, different states can define these various elements in different ways and require different things for this to be a viable claim. I will say up front that the offensiveness of these texts is something that really shouldn't be disputed. I mean, even Trooper Proctor himself was basically required to say on the stand that those texts were disgusting and he never should have said those things. And as to the newsworthiness element, now they're newsworthy because they're part of this question as to how this information impacted the overall investigation in the case. But if we're looking at the time when Trooper Proctor sent those text messages to those individual people, no, there's no way that this information was in any way newsworthy. Now, turning to the other 2 elements of this claim, as to the public disclosure piece, some states will say that the disclosure needs to be made to the public at large to qualify here. But in Massachusetts, that is not a requirement. Apparently, disclosure can run afoul of this law even if it's just made between a few people. For example, courts have found that intercorporate disclosures of an employee's private information shared among other employees can be enough to qualify for a public disclosure under this law. And so here, even though Trooper Proctor arguably never intended for these text messages to be read out to the public at large, he did intend to tell his high school buddies, for example, all about her quote-unquote balloon knot issues. And so this then leads us to the next element, the private nature of the facts shared. For this element, Massachusetts law says that this law protects people from disclosure of facts that are of a highly personal or intimate nature where there exists no legitimate countervailing interest. Specifically, medical information has been found to fit the bill for private information, obviously. And looking at these texts, I can't think of a fact or series of facts that's more personal or intimate in nature than this particular kind of medical information. And what's more, obviously Trooper Proctor's high school buddies had no legitimate countervailing interest in this information at all. It wasn't even related to the investigation itself. Trooper Proctor had no business talking about that when investigating whether Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with her car. And that actually leads me to wonder how he even got that information within 16 hours of investigating this case. I will say that's pretty fast for getting access to Karen Reed's health records, and so I'd be very curious about who told him that information in the first place. Could it be from talking with someone who had previously served as a confidant of Karen's? I don't know, but it surely would be interesting to find out, least of all, to see who else might be liable for disclosing Karen Reed's private medical information here. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Is there anything here that I might have missed in this whole topic of the fallout from Trooper Proctor's text messages about Karen Reed? Is there anything here that I said that you maybe hadn't previously considered? Let us know all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next one is out. And if you are really loving the content and you want to know how to best support the channel and get perks like early access to videos like this one, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by supporting on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. See you in the next one.